The morning sun cast long shadows across the red rocks of Arizona Territory, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold. Sarah Bennett stood at the edge of the wagon trail, her worn leather boots dusty from the 3-week journey that had brought her to this desolate corner of the frontier. The wind whipped strands of auburn hair across her face as she gazed at the small settlement of Cedar Ridge sprawled before her, a collection of weathered buildings that barely qualified as a town. She had come west seeking a new beginning, leaving behind the suffocating grief of Boston, where every street corner reminded her of Thomas, her late husband who had succumbed to consumption 2 winters past. The inheritance he left was modest, but enough to purchase passage west and perhaps start a small boarding house. Sarah had convinced herself that the frontier would offer the anonymity and purpose she desperately needed. Cedar Ridge consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, a small church with a crooked steeple, and a handful of adobe houses scattered like dice across the dusty plain. Beyond the settlement, the landscape stretched endlessly, mesas rising like ancient sentinels, their red faces scarred by wind and time. Saguaro cacti stood with arms raised in perpetual surrender to the merciless sun. "This is as far as I go, ma'am," the wagon driver announced, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. His weathered face showed the deep lines of a man who had spent decades under the desert sun. "You sure about this? Cedar Ridge ain't exactly friendly territory these days." Sarah lifted her chin, a gesture of determination she had perfected during months of well-meaning relatives trying to dissuade her from this journey. "I'm quite certain. Mr. Crawford, thank you for safe passage." The driver shrugged and began unloading her modest belongings. 2 trunks, a carpet bag, and a small crate containing her most precious possessions, her grandmother's china, Thomas's pocket watch, and the daguerreotype of their wedding day. As he worked, he spoke in a low voice, casting nervous glances toward the horizon. "Apache been stirring up trouble lately, raiding parties hitting the supply wagons, stealing cattle. Folks here are mighty jumpy. That's why half the buildings stand empty. People got scared and headed back east or pushed on to California." Sarah had heard the stories during her journey, whispered conversations around campfires about the escalating tensions between the Apache tribes and the ever-encroaching settlers. The recent discovery of silver in the nearby mountains had brought a fresh wave of prospectors and fortune seekers, each stake claimed representing another piece of land the Apache considered sacred. "I appreciate your concern," Sarah said, counting out the remaining fare from her small purse. "But I've come too far to turn back now." The driver pocketed the coins and climbed back onto his wagon. "The widow Morrison runs the boarding house, that adobe building with the blue door. She's about the only one might have a room. Stay clear of the saloon after dark. And ma'am," he paused, meeting her eyes with a genuine concern, "don't go wandering outside town alone. There's one Apache in particular folks talk about, a warrior named Gray Wolf. They say he moves like smoke through the desert, and he's got no love for white folks. Lost his whole family to cavalry rifles, or so the story goes." With that warning, Crawford snapped the reins, and the wagon rolled away, leaving Sarah standing alone with her belongings in the dusty street. A few townspeople had emerged to observe the newcomer. A woman in a faded calico dress swept her porch with aggressive strokes, while 2 men outside the general store ceased their conversation to stare openly. Sarah straightened her travel-worn dress and began dragging her trunks toward the boarding house. The blue door stood out like a piece of sky that had fallen to earth, the only spot of color in the sun-bleached town. Before she could knock, it swung open to reveal a stern-faced woman in her 50s, gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "You must be the Boston woman Crawford mentioned in his last letter," the woman said without preamble. "I'm Agnes Morrison. Room and board is $2 a week, paid in advance. No gentlemen callers after 8 o'clock. No liquor, no loud behavior. Breakfast at 6, supper at 5. You miss it. You go hungry." "Those terms are acceptable," Sarah replied, grateful for the straightforward approach. She had grown weary of false pleasantries during her journey. Agnes helped her carry the trunks to a small room at the back of the house. It was sparse but clean. an iron bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand with a chipped pitcher, and a narrow window that looked out onto the desert. Through the wavering heat, Sarah could see the mountains in the distance, purple shadows suggesting hidden canyons and secret places. "You picked a peculiar time to come west," Agnes said, studying Sarah with sharp eyes. "Most folks are leaving, not arriving. The Apache situation has everyone on edge. Just last week, the Hendricks Ranch was burned. They found Jimi Hendrix shot full of arrows, though some say it wasn't Apache who done it, just made to look that way." Sarah unpinned her traveling hat and set it on the bed. "I needed a change of scenery, Mrs. Morrison. Sometimes a person needs to go where nobody knows their past." Agnes's expression softened slightly. "Running from something or to something? Perhaps both," Sarah admitted. That evening, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread shared with Agnes and two other boarders, a surveyor and a traveling preacher, Sarah ventured out to explore the town. The sun was setting, turning the sky into a canvas of orange and pink. She made her way to the general store, needing basic supplies and hoping to begin establishing herself in the community. The store's proprietor, a thin man with nervous hands, introduced himself as Cornelius Pratt. He filled her order while maintaining a stream of conversation, clearly starved for news from the East. Sarah obliged with harmless anecdotes about Boston weather and fashion, carefully avoiding any mention of her personal circumstances. "You'll want to be careful, Mrs. Bennett," Pratt said as he wrapped her purchases in brown paper. "Things have been plenty tense lately. The Apache don't take kindly to settlers, especially now that the cavalry's been pushing them off their traditional hunting grounds. There's talk of bringing in more troops from Fort Buchanan. I'm sure the authorities have matters well in hand," Sarah said diplomatically. Pratt leaned across the counter, lowering his voice. "Between you and me, ma'am, it's not just the Apache we need to worry about. There's rough men in these parts, claim jumpers, rustlers, men who've come west because the law back east got too interested in their activities. A woman alone. Well, just be careful." Sarah thanked him for his concern and gathered her packages. As she stepped outside, the desert evening wrapped around her like a cool shawl. The town seemed even smaller in the gathering darkness, a fragile human foothold in a vast, indifferent landscape. Walking back to the boarding house, she passed the saloon where yellow light spilled onto the street, along with rough laughter and the tinny sound of a piano. Men lounged against the hitching posts, passing a bottle between them. One called out to her, making a crude suggestion that she pretended not to hear. That night, lying in the narrow bed, Sarah listened to the foreign sounds of her new home, the distant yip of coyotes, the whisper of wind through the desert, and somewhere, so faint she might have imagined it, the rhythmic beating of drums. She thought of the Apache warrior Crawford had mentioned, Gray Wolf, moving like smoke through the darkness, despite the warnings. She felt more curiosity than fear. What drove a man to such violence? What losses had shaped him into the fearsome figure of frontier legend? She had come west to escape the past, but already she sensed that Cedar Ridge held its own ghosts, its own complicated history written in blood and dust across the unforgiving landscape. The boundary between civilization and wilderness was thinner here, marked by nothing more substantial than a few buildings and the stubborn will of those who insisted on calling this hard place home. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last thought was of the mountains she had seen through her window, purple and mysterious in the distance. Somewhere out there, beyond the reach of Cedar Ridge's flickering lights, another world existed, older, wilder, and governed by different laws than those she had known in Boston. She had come seeking a new life, but what she would find in this sun-scorched territory might be more than she had bargained for. The desert wind continued to blow, carrying with it the scent of sage and something else, the faint promise of rain, or perhaps trouble, gathering like storm clouds on the horizon. 3 weeks had passed since Sarah's arrival in Cedar Ridge, and she had settled into a routine that helped keep the loneliness at bay. She assisted Agnes with the boarding house chores, mended clothes for extra income, and had even begun teaching letters to some of the local children whose parents couldn't afford the traveling schoolmaster's fees. On this particular morning, she decided to venture beyond the town's boundaries for the first time. Agnes needed medicinal herbs that grew near the creek a few miles north, and Sarah had volunteered to gather them. The older woman had protested, reminding her of the dangers. But Sarah insisted she would stay within sight of the well-worn trail and return before the noon heat became unbearable. The desert morning held a deceptive coolness as Sarah set out with a canvas bag and a canteen of water. She wore her plainest dress and had borrowed Agnes's wide-brimmed hat for protection against the sun. The trail wound between towering saguaros and clusters of prickly pear, following the ancient path carved by countless feet over generations. As she walked, Sarah found herself captivated by the stark beauty surrounding her. The desert wasn't barren as she had imagined. It teemed with subtle life. Lizards darted across rocks, leaving tiny trails in the sand. Birds she couldn't name called from the thorny branches of mesquite trees. The air smelled of creosote and sun-baked earth. She found the creek exactly where Agnes had described, a ribbon of green cutting through the blonde grass and red rocks. Cottonwoods provided blessed shade, their leaves whispering secrets in a language she didn't understand. Sarah knelt by the water's edge, identifying the plants Agnes had described: desert willow for fever, prickly poppy for pain, and mesquite pods that could be ground into flour. Lost in her task, she didn't notice how far she had wandered upstream until the sun climbed higher and the heat began to press down like a physical weight. When she finally looked up from filling her bag, the familiar trail was nowhere in sight. She had followed the creek's meandering path too far, and now the landscape looked alien and threatening. Sarah tried to retrace her steps, but the creek twisted and turned in ways that confused her city-bred sense of direction. The sun beat down mercilessly, and her canteen, she realized with growing alarm, was already half empty. Panic began to flutter in her chest like a trapped bird. She forced herself to think clearly. Follow the creek back downstream. Surely that would lead her to the trail. But as she hurried along the bank, the sand grabbed at her boots, and thorns tore at her skirts. The cottonwoods thinned out, leaving her exposed to the brutal sun. Her mouth felt dry as cotton, and she rationed her remaining water in tiny sips. Hours seemed to pass, though she couldn't be certain. The sun reached its zenith, and the heat became a living thing, pressing against her skin, making each breath feel like inhaling fire. Her vision began to shimmer and dance. The creek, which should have been her guide, disappeared into a dry wash, leaving her completely disoriented. Sarah stumbled forward, no longer sure of any direction except away from where she was. Her water was gone, her lips cracked and bleeding. The borrowed hat had been lost somewhere among the thorns, and the sun punished her exposed head without mercy. She thought she saw buildings in the distance, but they dissolved like mirages when she tried to focus. It was then she heard the horses. At first, she felt relief. Rescue was at hand. But as the sound grew closer, accompanied by rough voices and coarse laughter, a different kind of fear seized her. These weren't townspeople come looking for her. The voices were unfamiliar, speaking in a mixture of English and Spanish, their tone predatory. 3 men appeared from behind a cluster of rocks, mounted on dusty horses. Their clothes marked them as drifters, torn and travel-stained, with no badge of honest work. The leader, a man with a scarred face and cold eyes, grinned when he saw her. "Well, well, what have we here?" He dismounted with practiced ease, his companions following suit. "A little lost lamb, far from the flock." Sarah backed away, but her legs trembled with exhaustion. "I'm from Cedar Ridge. People will be looking for me." The scarred man laughed. "Cedar Ridge is miles from here, sweetheart, and even if someone's looking, they won't find you in time to matter." The other 2 men circled around, cutting off any escape route. One was young, barely out of his teens, with the nervous eyes that wouldn't meet hers. The third was older, grizzled, with hands that kept touching the knife at his belt. "Please," Sarah said, hating the tremor in her voice. I have money back in town. I can pay you. Oh, you'll pay, the leader said, advancing slowly, enjoying her fear. But not with money. Sarah's hand found a rock, and she gripped it desperately, though she knew it would be useless against 3 armed men. The young one had started to look uncomfortable, muttering something about just taking her valuables, but the leader silenced him with a look. They were close now, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and sweat, see the cruel anticipation in their eyes. Sarah raised the rock, determined to fight even though she knew it was hopeless. Then, like a shadow given form, he appeared. The Apache warrior seemed to materialize from the very landscape, as if the rocks and sand had suddenly taken human shape. One moment the space behind the grizzled man was empty. The next, it was occupied by a figure that moved with lethal grace. Before any of them could react, the warrior's knife had found the grizzled man's throat. The man dropped without a sound, his hands clutching at the mortal wound. The young drifter screamed and fumbled for his gun, but an arrow whispered through the air and found his shoulder, spinning him to the ground. The scarred leader had better reflexes. He whirled, drawing his pistol in one smooth motion. But the Apache was already moving. They collided in a blur of violence, rolling in the dust. Sarah scrambled back, her mind struggling to process what she was witnessing. The fight was brief but vicious. The Apache fought with an economy of motion that spoke of years of training, every movement purposeful, deadly. The scarred man was strong and desperate, but he was no match for the warrior's skill. Within moments, he lay still, his own knife buried between his ribs. The young drifter, arrow still protruding from his shoulder, had managed to crawl to his horse. The Apache let him go, watching with dark eyes as the wounded man hauled himself into the saddle and fled, leaving a trail of blood in the sand. Then the warrior turned to Sarah. She had collapsed against a boulder, her strength finally exhausted. Through sun-dazzled eyes, she saw him approach, tall and lean, dressed in deerskin and cloth, moving with the fluid grace of a predator. His face was angular, handsome in a fierce way, with high cheekbones and eyes the color of obsidian. Long black hair was held back by a leather band, and across his chest, she could see the scars of old battles. He stopped a few feet away, studying her with an expression she couldn't read. Sarah waited for death, too exhausted to feel proper fear anymore. Instead, the warrior knelt and offered her a water skin. The leather was worn smooth, and the water inside was warm but clean. Sarah drank greedily, the liquid bringing life back to her parched throat. When she finally lowered the skin, she found him still watching her, his head tilted slightly as if she were a puzzle to solve. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't respond, might not have understood. Instead, he stood and gestured for her to follow. When she struggled to rise, her legs refusing to cooperate, he made an impatient sound and simply lifted her as if she weighed nothing. Sarah wanted to protest, but darkness was creeping in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she remembered was the steady rhythm of his walk, the smell of leather and sage, and the strange sense that she was safer in this Apache warrior's arms than she had been since arriving in Arizona territory. When consciousness returned, she found herself in the shade of a rock overhang, the worst of the day's heat passing. The warrior sat nearby, cleaning his weapons with methodical precision. The bodies of the 2 dead men were nowhere to be seen. He had tended to her while she was unconscious. Her torn dress had been modestly arranged, a cool cloth placed on her forehead, and her boots removed to let her feet breathe. Such small kindnesses from someone she had been warned was a savage killer. As she stirred, he looked up, and their eyes met properly for the first time. In that gaze, Sarah saw not the monster of frontier legend, but a man, complicated, dangerous certainly, but human nonetheless. He had saved her life. This Apache warrior who supposedly hated all whites. He spoke then, a single word in accented English that might have been a question or a statement. "Safe." Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. He seemed satisfied and went back to his weapons. as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah realized her ordeal wasn't over. She was still lost, still in the company of a man her people considered an enemy. But for now, in this moment, she was alive. And the man who had saved her, this fierce warrior the townspeople called Grey Wolf, was not what she had expected. Not at all. As the desert cooled with approaching evening, Grey Wolf rose and began gathering dried brush for a fire. Sarah watched him work, noting the efficiency of his movements, the way he seemed to blend with the landscape rather than impose himself upon it. When he had a small fire crackling, he produced strips of dried meat from a leather pouch and offered her some. The jerky was tough and salty, but Sarah ate gratefully. Her strength was slowly returning, though her head still ached from the sun's punishment. She studied her rescuer in the firelight, trying to reconcile the gentle care he had shown with the fearsome reputation that preceded him. "Grey Wolf," she said quietly, testing the name. His eyes flickered to hers, a slight narrowing that might have been surprise. He nodded once, acknowledging the identification. "I'm Sarah," she offered. Placing a hand on her chest, he repeated the name, his accent softening the syllables into something almost musical. Then he pointed to the darkening sky and made a gesture she understood. They would travel when the moon rose. The temporary camp was sparse but organized. Grey Wolf had chosen the location well. The rock overhang provided shelter while offering clear views in all directions. Sarah noticed how he positioned himself between her and the open desert, a protective stance that seemed unconscious. As they waited for full darkness, he tended to his weapons with the care of a craftsman. Sarah found herself fascinated by the intricate beadwork on his knife sheath, the delicate fletching on his arrows. These were tools of war, yes, but also works of art. When the moon climbed high enough to silver the landscape, Grey Wolf extinguished the fire and stood. He gestured for her to follow, but when Sarah tried to pull on her boots, she gasped. Her feet were swollen and blistered from the morning's ordeal. Without a word, he knelt and examined the damage with surprisingly gentle fingers. From his pack, he produced a small container of salve that smelled of pine and something else, herbs she couldn't identify. He applied it to her blisters with careful precision, then wrapped her feet in soft leather strips. The intimacy of the act made Sarah's cheeks burn. No man except Thomas had ever touched her feet. And here was this Apache warrior, this supposed savage, showing more kindness than the civilized men who had attacked her. When he lifted her again, cradling her against his chest, Sarah didn't protest. She could feel the steady beat of his heart through the deerskin shirt, smell the mixture of smoke, leather, and wild sage that clung to him. It should have frightened her, this closeness to a man her people called enemy. But instead, she felt oddly safe. They traveled through the night, Grey Wolf moving with sure steps despite the burden of carrying her. The moon transformed the desert into an alien landscape of silver and shadow. Occasionally, he would pause, listening to sounds Sarah couldn't hear, reading signs invisible to her untrained eyes. Just before dawn, they reached the outskirts of what appeared to be a temporary Apache camp. Sarah's heart began to race as she saw other figures moving in the dim light, women tending fires, men checking weapons, children peering from behind their mothers' skirts. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Voices rose in the Apache language, some angry, some curious. Grey Wolf responded in the same tongue, his tone firm but not aggressive. Sarah understood none of the words, but the body language was clear. Many here were not pleased to see a white woman in their midst. An older woman approached, her face weathered but dignified, gray hair braided with beads and feathers. She spoke sharply to Grey Wolf, gesturing at Sarah with obvious displeasure. He responded calmly, never raising his voice, but standing his ground. Finally, the woman threw up her hands in apparent disgust and stalked away. Grey Wolf carried Sarah to a small shelter made of bent saplings and canvas, setting her down on a bed of pine boughs covered with blankets. Other Apache began to gather, staring at Sarah with expressions ranging from hostility to curiosity. A young woman spat at the ground near Sarah's feet, muttering what were clearly curses. An older man with a scarred face spoke harshly to Grey Wolf, his hand resting on a war club. Through it all, Grey Wolf remained a solid presence beside her, answering challenges with quiet authority. Sarah couldn't understand the exchanges, but she recognized the dynamic. He was defending his decision to bring her here, possibly at considerable cost to his own standing. As the sun rose, painting the camp in warm colors, the initial confrontation seemed to settle into uneasy acceptance. The Apache went about their morning routines, though Sarah could feel their watchful eyes upon her. Women prepared food over cook fires. Men tended to horses and weapons. Children played with bone dolls and stick hoops. Grey Wolf brought her water and a bowl of unfamiliar mush that tasted of corn and beans. He showed her how to eat it with a piece of fry bread, patient with her clumsy attempts. When she had finished, he spoke to a middle-aged woman who approached reluctantly. The woman, whom Grey Wolf called Ayana, examined Sarah's feet with clinical detachment. She clucked her tongue at the blisters and produced her own medicines, replacing Grey Wolf's battlefield remedies with more sophisticated treatments. Her touch was skilled but impersonal, making it clear she helped only because Grey Wolf had asked. As the day progressed, Sarah found herself in a strange position, neither prisoner nor guest, existing in a liminal space defined by Grey Wolf's protection. He didn't leave her side for long, returning frequently to check on her, to bring her water, to simply sit nearby in companionable silence. She watched him interact with his people, noting the respect he commanded despite the controversy of her presence. Young warriors deferred to him, children ran to show him their small treasures, and even those who disagreed with his decision regarding her did so carefully, acknowledging his authority. As evening approached, bringing blessed coolness, the camp gathered around a central fire. An elder began to speak, his voice rising and falling in what seemed to be a traditional story. Children sat rapt, while adults nodded at familiar passages. Sarah found herself mesmerized by the scene, so different from the church services and social gatherings of Cedar Ridge, yet serving the same fundamental human needs for community and shared narrative. These people, so feared and vilified by her own kind, were families like any other, bound by love and tradition and mutual survival. Grey Wolf sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cooling air. He didn't translate the elder's words, but his presence was communication enough. She was under his protection, part of his space, if not his world. When the stars emerged, brilliant in the clear desert sky, the gathering began to disperse. Grey Wolf led Sarah back to the shelter he had designated for her use. As she settled onto the pine bough bed, exhausted by the day's events, he spoke in his careful English. "Tomorrow, I take you back." Sarah nodded, understanding the necessity. She couldn't stay here among people who saw her as an enemy, no matter how much Grey Wolf might protect her. But the thought of returning to Cedar Ridge, to the suspicious stares and whispered judgments, suddenly seemed less appealing than it had that morning. "Rest now," he said, and there was something in his voice, a softness that belied his warrior's appearance. He sat just outside the shelter, his back against a post, keeping watch. Sarah lay on the unfamiliar bed, surrounded by the sounds of the Apache camp settling for the night. Soft voices, a baby's cry quickly soothed, the stamp and snort of horses. She thought of the violence of the morning, how close she had come to a fate worse than death, and how this man, this Apache warrior she had been warned against, had appeared like an avenging angel. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Everything she had been told, every warning and prejudice, crumbled against the reality of Grey Wolf's actions. As sleep began to claim her, Sarah heard singing from somewhere in the camp, a woman's voice, haunting and beautiful, carrying a melody unlike anything in her musical experience. It spoke of loss and endurance, of a people clinging to their ways despite the encroaching tide of change. Grey Wolf's silhouette remained constant against the starfield, a guardian between her and any who might wish her harm. In that moment, Sarah felt safer than she had in months. protected by the very person she had been taught to fear most. The irony wasn't lost on her, even as exhaustion pulled her under. In the morning, she would return to her own world, to the suspicious inhabitants of Cedar Ridge and their small prejudices. But tonight, in an Apache camp under infinite stars, guarded by a warrior whose kindness contradicted every story she'd been told, Sarah Bennett began to understand that the frontier's greatest danger might not be the savages beyond the town's borders, but the blindness of those within. The journey back to Cedar Ridge began at dawn, with Grey Wolf carrying Sarah once more through the desert landscape. Her feet, though better after Ayana's treatment, still couldn't bear her weight for long distances. As they traveled, the silence between them felt different than before, weighted with unspoken understanding. When the town finally came into view, Grey Wolf set her down gently behind a cluster of rocks just beyond the settlement's edge. He wouldn't go closer. They both understood why. Sarah tested her weight on her tender feet, finding she could walk now, though carefully. "Thank you," she said, the words inadequate for what he had done. Grey Wolf studied her face for a long moment, then reached into his pouch and pulled out a small object, a piece of turquoise wrapped in leather cord. He pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it. "For protection," he said in his accented English. Then he was gone, melting back into the desert as if he had never been. Sarah stood alone, clutching the turquoise, feeling oddly bereft. She limped slowly toward town, each step taking her further from that strange interlude of safety and deeper into a world that suddenly felt foreign. Her return caused an immediate sensation. Agnes Morrison came rushing from the boarding house, her usual stern composure cracking with relief. "Sarah, child, we thought you were dead." Search parties have been out since yesterday. Soon, half the town had gathered, peppering her with questions. Sheriff Watson, a gruff man with suspicious eyes, pushed through the crowd. "What happened? Mrs. Bennett? Where have you been?" Sarah had prepared her story during the walk, a partial truth that omitted the most important parts. "I got lost following the creek. Some drifters found me, tried to—" She let the implication hang. "But they quarreled among themselves, fighting over who would—" Again, she left the sentence unfinished. "One killed the other, and the third was wounded. I ran while they were distracted, hid through the night, and found my way back this morning." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. "These drifters, can you describe them?" Sarah gave vague descriptions that could fit half the outlaws in the territory. She felt the turquoise burning in her closed fist. "Hidden from view. Lucky escape," Watson said finally, though his tone suggested skepticism. "Best you don't wander off alone again, ma'am." Agnes hustled her inside, fussing over her sunburned face and blistered feet. But even in the familiar surroundings of the boarding house, Sarah felt displaced. The narrow room that had been her refuge now felt like a cage. When she finally had privacy, she pulled out the turquoise and studied it in the lamplight. The stone was smooth, worn by years of handling. The leather soft with age, a warrior's talisman. Now hers. Days passed, but Sarah couldn't settle back into her routine. She went through the motions, helping Agnes, teaching the children, mending clothes, but her mind wandered constantly to the desert, to a temporary camp under stars, to dark eyes that had looked at her with such unexpected gentleness. The townspeople treated her differently now, some with pity, as if her ordeal had marked her as tragic. Others with suspicion, particularly after the sheriff found the bodies of 2 drifters in the desert, killed with Apache weapons. The surviving drifter had made it to another settlement, raving about an Apache demon who had appeared from nowhere. "You were fortunate," Agnes said one evening as they prepared supper. "The good Lord was watching over you." Sarah touched the hidden turquoise at her throat, worn now on a chain beneath her collar. Had it been divine providence, or something more earthly that had saved her? The question tormented her nights. 3 weeks after her return, while hanging laundry behind the boarding house, she sensed a presence, nothing she could define, a shift in the air, a feeling of being observed. Her heart began to race as she scanned the desert beyond the town's edge. There, a figure on a distant ridge, mounted on a painted pony, still as a statue. Even at that distance, she knew who it was. They regarded each other across the gulf of space and circumstance, and Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of bonds she hadn't known were there. That night, sleep eluded her entirely. She sat by her window, watching the moonlit desert, wondering if he was out there still. The turquoise felt warm against her skin, a secret connection to a world she had glimpsed but couldn't enter. The next day brought troubling news. A supply wagon had been attacked, the drivers killed. The army was sending reinforcements from Fort Buchanan, and there was talk of a campaign to drive the Apache from the territory entirely. Sarah listened to the heated discussions in the general store, her heart sinking with each vengeful declaration. "Savages," Cornelius Pratt spat. "No reasoning with them. Only solution is to clear them out entirely, every last one." "Now, Cornelius," the Reverend protested mildly. "They're God's children, too, however misguided." "God's children don't massacre innocent folk," another man interjected. "I say we join up with the cavalry. Show them Apache what real justice looks like." Sarah wanted to scream at them, to tell them about the kindness she had experienced, the humanity she had witnessed. But she held her tongue, knowing such words would only cast more suspicion upon her. That evening, as she helped serve supper to the boarders, the surveyor mentioned seeing a Apache sign near the eastern wells. "Fresh tracks, maybe a dozen riders. They're getting bolder." Sarah's hand trembled as she poured coffee, earning a sharp look from Agnes. Later, cleaning dishes, she found herself staring out the kitchen window at the darkening desert, wondering where he was, if he thought of her as she did of him. It was near midnight when she heard it, a sound so faint it might have been wind, but her body recognized it instantly. Someone was in the courtyard behind the boarding house. Every reasonable thought told her to wake Agnes, to call for help. Instead, she wrapped a shawl around her nightgown and slipped out the back door. He stood in the shadows of the tool shed, barely visible except for the glint of moonlight on silver ornaments. Sarah's breath caught. She should have been terrified, alone in the dark with an Apache warrior. Instead, she felt that same inexplicable safety. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "It's dangerous." Grey Wolf stepped forward just enough for her to see his face. There was a new scar on his cheekbone, fresh enough to still be healing. "Soldiers come," he said quietly. "Many soldiers. You must know, they plan to attack all Apache, not just warriors, women, children, elders." Sarah's heart clenched. "How do you know this?" A bitter smile touched his lips. "We have ears in many places." They stood facing each other, the space between them charged with unspoken words. Sarah knew she should go back inside, pretend this meeting never happened. Instead, she found herself stepping closer. "Why did you save me?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Grey Wolf was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in careful English, "You did not look at me with hate, in town. I watch sometimes. Others see Apache and see death. You saw man." The admission stunned her. He had been watching the town. Watching her specifically? The thought should have been alarming, but wasn't. "Your people and mine," he continued. "They make war, but you," he struggled for words. "You are different." "I'm not," Sarah said softly. "I came here full of the same fears, the same prejudices. You're the one who showed me different." Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability quickly masked. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched the chain at her throat where the turquoise lay hidden. "You wear it. Every day." His fingers lingered for a heartbeat, warm against her skin, then dropped away. "I must go, but Sarah," the way he said her name, soft and careful, made her shiver. "Be ready. When fighting comes, find safe place. Basement, root cellar. Stay hidden." "Wait," but he was already moving, dissolving into shadow. "Grey Wolf," she called softly, desperately. He paused at the edge of darkness, looking back. In that moment, with moonlight catching the planes of his face, she saw past the warrior to the man beneath, lonely, haunted, carrying burdens she could only guess at. "Be safe," he said, and then he was gone. Sarah stood alone in the courtyard, her heart pounding, skin still tingling where he had touched her. Everything she had been taught, every proper sentiment, every reasonable thought told her this was madness. He was Apache, she was white. Their peoples were enemies, perhaps days away from open war, but her traitorous heart didn't care about any of that. She crept back to her room, knowing sleep would be impossible. Through her window, she searched the darkness for any sign of him, but the desert kept its secrets. The turquoise lay warm against her chest, a tangible reminder that the encounter had been real. In the morning, she would return to pretense, playing the role of the properly traumatized white woman. She would listen to talk of Apache raids and military justice, biting her tongue bloody to keep from defending those everyone else saw as enemies. She would live a lie, because the truth, that she had been saved by and was now dreaming of an Apache warrior, would see her cast out, or worse. But tonight, in the privacy of her room, Sarah Bennett faced the truth that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. Somewhere in the desert, a man named Grey Wolf moved through the darkness, and she wanted nothing more than to follow him into that wild, dangerous freedom. The realization should have horrified her. Instead, for the first time since Thomas's death, she felt truly, blazingly alive. The cavalry arrived 3 days later, a long column of blue uniforms and gleaming weapons that transformed Cedar Ridge into an armed camp. Captain Marcus Thornton, a man with cold gray eyes and a meticulously waxed mustache, established his headquarters in the saloon, much to the owner's delight and the Temperance Society's horror. Sarah watched from the boarding house window as soldiers set up tents on the outskirts of town, their presence both reassuring and ominous. The townspeople greeted them as saviors, but she couldn't forget Grey Wolf's warning about their true intentions. That evening, Captain Thornton addressed the gathered townspeople. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to end the Apache threat once and for all. Any information about their movements, their camps, their sympathizers, should be reported immediately." His gaze swept the crowd, lingering on Sarah. "I understand you had a recent encounter with hostile Indians, Mrs. Bennett?" "Drifters attacked me," Sarah said carefully. "I never saw any Apache." The captain's eyes narrowed slightly. "How fortunate. Nevertheless, if you remember any details that might help our mission." Sarah nodded mutely, clutching her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Beneath it, the turquoise seemed to burn against her skin. Over the following days, the town transformed into a staging ground for war. Soldiers drilled in the dusty streets. Scouts rode out at dawn and returned at dusk with reports of Apache sign. The tension was palpable, like the air before a thunderstorm. Sarah tried to maintain her routine, but concentration was impossible. Every distant dust cloud might be cavalry riding out or Apache defending their territory. Sleep became elusive, her dreams filled with dark eyes and gentle hands, punctuated by nightmares of violence. A week after the cavalry's arrival, everything changed. Sarah was at the general store when Jimmy Patterson, a scout, burst in. Apache war party spotted heading for Miller's Canyon. Captains mounting up the whole company. The store erupted in excitement and fear. Sarah felt ice in her veins. Miller's Canyon was where she'd seen smoke from campfires, where families might be gathered, where children played. She rushed back to the boarding house, her mind racing. In her room, she paced frantically, torn between self-preservation and conscience. Through her window, she watched the cavalry mount up, saw the grim determination on their faces. These weren't just soldiers following orders. Many were eager for the fight, for revenge against an enemy they'd been taught to hate, unable to bear it. Sarah slipped out the back door and headed for the stable. She had to do something, anything. But as she reached the edge of town, a familiar figure stepped from the shadows. "No," Grey Wolf said firmly. He looked exhausted, dust covered from hard riding. too dangerous. They're going to attack your people." "We know. Families are moving deeper into mountains." His hand caught her arm as she tried to pass. "Sarah, you cannot help. They see you there. They know you warned us. They kill you as traitor." The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. She was trapped between worlds, belonging to neither. "I can't just do nothing while we fight? While we die?" His voice was bitter. "This is our way now. Has been since white men came to our lands." Tears burned her eyes. "It's not right. No, but it is truth." His grip gentled, thumb brushing over her sleeve. "You have good heart. Too good for this world we make with blood and hate." The sound of horses approaching made them both freeze. Grey Wolf pulled her behind a storage building, pressing her against the rough wood as he peered around the corner. A cavalry patrol was passing, heading out to join the main force. When they were gone, Sarah found herself pressed against Grey Wolf's chest, his arm protective around her waist. She should have pulled away, but instead she stayed, feeling his heartbeat quick against her palm. "You risk too much coming here," she whispered. "Had to warn town people who trade fair with us. And—" He looked down at her, something raw in his expression. "Had to see you safe." The admission hung between them, dangerous as loaded weapons. Sarah knew she should step back, return to the boarding house, pretend this moment never happened. Instead, she lifted her hand to touch the new scar on his cheek. "What happened?" "Soldiers attacked hunting party. We fought. I survived. Not all did." The pain in his voice made her chest ache. Without thinking, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips gently to the scar. Grey Wolf went utterly still, his breath catching. When she pulled back, his eyes were wide with surprise and something else, a hunger that matched her own. "Sarah," he said roughly, her name a warning and a plea. But the moment shattered as gunfire echoed from the direction of Miller's Canyon, rapid volleys that spoke of serious battle. Grey Wolf's head snapped toward the sound, his body tensing for action. "I must go," he said, already pulling away. "My brothers need me." "Be careful," Sarah begged, catching his hand. "Please." He squeezed her fingers once, then vaulted onto a painted pony she hadn't even noticed in the shadows. As he gathered the reins, he looked back at her one last time. "Stay safe, little dove. When this ends, if I survive, I come for you." Then he was gone, riding hard toward the sound of battle, leaving Sarah alone with the echo of his promise and the terrible fear that she would never see him again. The battle raged for hours. From the boarding house, they could hear the gunfire, see the smoke rising in the distance. The townspeople gathered in clusters, alternating between bloodthirsty excitement and genuine fear that the fighting might spread to Cedar Ridge. Sarah helped Agnes prepare bandages and clear spaces for wounded, though her hands shook so badly she could barely tear the cloth. Every time the door opened, she looked up hoping for news, dreading what that news might be. Near sunset, the cavalry began returning. The celebration that had been anticipated turned somber as the toll became clear. 7 soldiers dead, dozens wounded. The Apache had fought fiercely, using the canyon's terrain to their advantage before melting away into the mountains. Captain Thornton, his uniform torn and blood-stained, established a field hospital in the church. Sarah worked alongside the other women, tending wounds and offering water to suffering men. But even as she wrapped bandages and murmured comfort, her thoughts were with the Apache wounded, who had no field hospital, no morphine for their pain. "Savages fought like demons," one soldier muttered through gritted teeth as she cleaned a bullet wound. "But we gave better than we got. Must have killed 20, 30 of them." Sarah's hands stilled for a moment before she forced herself to continue. 20 or 30. Grey Wolf could be among them, could be lying somewhere bleeding into the desert sand. The thought made her physically ill. As night fell, she finally escaped the makeshift hospital, stepping into the cool darkness to catch her breath. The stars looked down impassively, unchanged by the day's violence. Somewhere in those mountains, families mourned their dead. Warriors bled from their wounds. Children cried for fathers who would never return. "Mrs. Bennett?" She turned to find Captain Thornton watching her, his expression unreadable in the darkness. "You've been most helpful today," he said. "Not all ladies would have such strong stomachs for this work. I've seen death before, Captain." "Indeed." He moved closer, and Sarah smelled whiskey on his breath. "Tell me, Mrs. Bennett, in your encounter with those drifters, did you perhaps see any Apache, even at a distance?" "I told you, I saw no one but the men who attacked me." "Curious that—" "The survivor swears an Apache warrior killed his companions. Described him quite vividly. Tall, scarred, rides a painted pony. We've been tracking this particular savage for months. Calls himself Grey Wolf." Sarah kept her expression neutral through sheer force of will. "As I said, I hid during the fighting. I saw nothing clearly." The captain studied her for a long moment. "Of course, trauma can affect memory. Still, if anything should come back to you, this Grey Wolf is particularly dangerous. He speaks English, moves freely among the settlements. Some even say he has sympathizers among the townsfolk." The threat was subtle but clear. Sarah lifted her chin. "I'm sure that's just rumor. Captain, who among us would aid those who wish us harm?" "Who indeed?" He touched his hat. "Good evening, Mrs. Bennett. Do be careful. In times of war, even innocent actions can be misinterpreted." He strode away, leaving Sarah shaking with delayed reaction. She knew she was under suspicion, knew she walked an increasingly dangerous line, but as she touched the turquoise at her throat, felt its smooth warmth. She also knew she couldn't betray Grey Wolf, no matter the cost. The night stretched endlessly. Sarah lay in her narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the transformed town, soldiers on patrol, horses restless in their pickets, occasional groans from the wounded in the church. Every sound might be news, might be Grey Wolf coming to fulfill his promise or soldiers coming to arrest her as a sympathizer. Dawn came without either, bringing only more casualties as scouting parties clashed with Apache defenders. The war Grey Wolf had predicted was here, and Sarah found herself caught in its center, her heart divided between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. But his words echoed in her memory. "When this ends, if I survive, I come for you." It was a promise to cling to, a hope to nurture through the dark days ahead. Somewhere in the mountains, a warrior fought for his people's survival, and in a small boarding house room, a woman waited, praying to any god who would listen that love might somehow survive where peace could not. 2 weeks passed in a blur of mounting tensions and sporadic violence. The cavalry's presence had not brought peace, but rather escalated the conflict into open warfare. Sarah continued her work at the boarding house, but her heart was never in it. Every night she stood at her window, searching the darkness for a sign, a shadow, anything that might tell her Grey Wolf still lived. The town had changed, hardened by fear and loss. Where once there had been cautious coexistence, now there was only hatred. The moderate voices were drowned out by calls for extermination. Even Reverend Morrison's sermons had taken on a militant tone, speaking of divine justice against the heathen. It was on a sweltering afternoon when everything came to a head. Sarah was returning from the general store with supplies when she noticed a commotion near the sheriff's office. A crowd had gathered, their voices raised in anger and excitement, pushing through. She saw what had drawn them: 3 Apache prisoners, hands bound, being roughly handled by soldiers. 2 were young warriors, defiant despite their wounds. The third was an elder, dignified even in captivity. But it was the 4th figure that made Sarah's blood run cold. Grey Wolf stood between 2 soldiers, his face bloodied but unbowed. His shirt was torn, revealing extensive bruising across his ribs. When his eyes found hers in the crowd, she saw a flash of warning before he looked away. "Finally caught the bastard," Captain Thornton announced triumphantly. "Grey Wolf himself, taken during a raid on their camp. He'll hang tomorrow at dawn, along with the others." The crowd cheered, but Sarah heard it as if from a great distance. Her legs felt weak, and she had to grip the hitching post to stay upright. Agnes, who had appeared beside her, mistook her reaction for fear. "Don't worry, dear. They'll be well guarded. Those savages won't hurt anyone else." Sarah managed to nod, not trusting her voice. She watched helplessly as the prisoners were dragged to the makeshift jail, a reinforced storage building behind the sheriff's office. Grey Wolf walked with dignity despite his injuries, but she could see the pain in each careful step. That evening, the town celebrated. The saloon did booming business, soldiers and townspeople toasting their victory. Sarah pleaded a headache and retired early, but sleep was impossible. She paced her small room, wild plans racing through her mind. She had to do something. But what? The jail was heavily guarded, the entire town on alert, near midnight, unable to bear it any longer. She slipped out of the boarding house. She had no real plan, only a desperate need to see him once more. The streets were quieter now, though soldiers still patrolled. Sarah kept to the shadows, her dark shawl helping her blend with the night. The jail was guarded by 2 soldiers, but they were relaxed, passing a flask between them. Sarah circled around, finding a small barred window at the back. Her heart pounded as she approached, terrified of being caught. "Grey Wolf," she whispered urgently. There was movement inside. Then his face appeared at the window. Even in the darkness, she could see the damage: split lip, blackened eye, cuts that spoke of brutal interrogation. "You should not be here," he said softly. "They're going to kill you!" Tears streamed down her face. Yes, his acceptance was calm, resigned. "It is good death, with my brothers." "No!" The word came out too loud, and she pressed her hand to her mouth. "There must be something." "Sarah!" His fingers wrapped around the bars, and she covered them with her own. "Listen, you gave me something I thought lost forever. Hope, gentleness, the memory of your kindness. It is enough. It's not enough," she sobbed quietly. "Not nearly enough. You must be strong," he continued urgently. "After tomorrow, suspicion will fade. Live your life. Find happiness. Forget the Apache who—" "Stop!" She pressed closer to the window. "Don't you dare tell me to forget you. Don't you dare!" Even battered and facing death, he managed a small smile. "Stubborn woman. This is why I—" He stopped, shaking his head. "Why you what?" she demanded. He was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly she almost missed it. "Why I love you." The words hung between them, precious and painful. Sarah's breath caught. "Grey Wolf! Shh! Someone comes!" She heard it too, footsteps approaching. With one last desperate squeeze of his fingers, she melted back into the darkness. She made it back to the boarding house without detection, but Grey Wolf's words echoed in her mind. He loved her, and tomorrow he would die. She sat at her window as dawn approached, watching the sky lighten with dread. The town began to stir early, eager for the spectacle. Sarah dressed mechanically, knowing she had to witness it, even though it would destroy something in her. The gallows had been hastily constructed in the main street. It seemed the entire town had gathered, along with most of the cavalry. The atmosphere was festive, obscene in its celebration of coming death. Sarah found a place at the edge of the crowd, her fingernails digging into her palms. The prisoners were brought out, and despite everything, they walked proudly. Grey Wolf's eyes swept the crowd and found hers briefly. In that look was everything they couldn't say: love, regret, farewell. Captain Thornton read the charges: murder, theft, attacks on civilian settlements. Sarah wanted to scream at the hypocrisy, at the litany of crimes that ignored who had invaded whose land, who had broken treaties, who had slaughtered women and children. As they positioned the prisoners on the platform, the elderly Apache began to sing, a death song, haunting and beautiful. The other warriors joined in, their voices rising in defiance. Even facing the noose, they would not be broken. Grey Wolf stood silently, his gaze now fixed on the distant mountains. Sarah understood. He was looking toward home, toward the sacred places he would never see again. Her hand found the turquoise at her throat, gripping it like an anchor. "Any last words?" the sheriff asked. The elder spoke in Apache. his tone dignified and proud. The young warrior spit at the crowd's feet. Then it was Grey Wolf's turn. He looked directly at Captain Thornton. "You kill us, but you kill yourselves too. This land will never truly be yours. It will remember." Then his eyes found Sarah one last time, and though he spoke to the crowd, his words were for her alone. "Some things are worth dying for. Some people worth living for. I found both." The crowd murmured, confused by his words, but Sarah understood, and her heart shattered. "Enough speeches," Thornton commanded. "Proceed." Sarah forced herself to watch, to bear witness. She owed him that much. But as the platform dropped, as the crowd cheered, something fundamental broke inside her. The turquoise burned against her skin, and she swayed on her feet. "Sarah!" Agnes caught her arm. "You're white as a sheet. Come away from here." She let Agnes lead her back to the boarding house, moving like a sleepwalker. Behind them, the celebration continued. But Sarah heard only the echo of a death song and the memory of last words meant for her alone. In her room, she collapsed on the bed, clutching the turquoise and sobbing until she had no tears left. Outside, Cedar Ridge celebrated its victory, never knowing that in one small room, a woman mourned an Apache warrior who had shown her what love could be across the boundaries of hatred and fear. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to human suffering. Sarah lay still, feeling hollowed out, emptied of everything but grief. Grey Wolf was gone, and with him, a part of her soul. But his words remained, carved into her heart. Some people were worth living for. Somehow, she would have to find a way to honor that. To live when all she wanted was to follow him into the darkness. The celebration continued into the night, but Sarah heard none of it. She sat at her window, looking toward the mountains, whispering a promise to the wind. "I will not forget. Not ever, not until my last breath." Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Lonely, defiant, free. Sarah pressed the turquoise to her lips and let the sound wash over her, carrying her love and grief to wherever spirits went when their earthly bonds were severed. 3 days after the execution, Sarah moved through her life like a ghost. She performed her duties mechanically, serving meals, mending clothes, teaching the children their letters, but her spirit was elsewhere. The turquoise never left her neck, hidden beneath high collars and modest shawls. Agnes watched her with growing concern. "You've not been yourself since the hanging," she observed one evening as they cleaned up after supper. "I know such violence can be disturbing to witness." If only Agnes knew the truth, that Sarah mourned not the violence, but the victim, that every night she dreamed of dark eyes and gentle hands, waking with tears on her cheeks and an ache in her chest that wouldn't ease. It was near midnight when she heard it, a soft tap at her window. Sarah's heart leapt impossibly, but when she looked, it wasn't Grey Wolf's ghost. A young Apache woman stood in the shadows, her face painted with ash in mourning. Sarah recognized her from the camp, Ayanna, the woman who had tended her feet. Without hesitation, she opened the window. "You come," Ayanna whispered urgently. "Now." "What? Why, he lives." The world tilted. Sarah gripped the windowsill. "That's impossible. You saw what they wanted you to see. Come now, or it will be too late." Sarah didn't hesitate. She threw on a dark dress and cloak, grabbed her medical supplies and what money she had, and climbed out the window. Ayanna led her through the sleeping town, moving with the same supernatural quiet Grey Wolf had possessed. 2 horses waited beyond the settlement. They rode hard through the night, Ayanna setting a punishing pace. Sarah clung to the saddle, hope and fear warring in her chest. How was it possible? She had seen him hang, had watched him die. As dawn broke, they reached a hidden canyon deep in the mountains. An Apache camp was concealed among the rocks, but this was different from the one she'd seen before. Smaller, more desperate. Warriors with haunted eyes watched their approach. Ayanna led her to a shelter set apart from the others. Inside, on a bed of blankets, lay Grey Wolf. He was alive but barely. His neck bore the cruel marks of the rope, purple and black bruising that made each breath a struggle. His eyes were closed, his body still. An elderly medicine man sat beside him, chanting softly. "How?" Sarah breathed, dropping to her knees beside him. The medicine man spoke in Apache, and Ayanna translated. The rope was cut by one of our warriors hidden in the crowd. Grey Wolf fell through the platform as planned. He held his breath, went limp. In the confusion, our people took the bodies, left others in their place. The soldiers were drunk on victory, did not look closely. Sarah's hands shook as she examined him. The damage was severe, crushed windpipe, possible damage to the spine. That he lived at all was miraculous, but his breathing was labored, his pulse weak. "The medicine man has done what he can," Ayanna said, "but Grey Wolf walks between worlds. We thought, perhaps you have white medicine. Perhaps you can call him back." Sarah opened her medical kit with trembling fingers. She had basic supplies, some laudanum for pain, but nothing for injuries this severe. Still, she had to try. She'd learned some things from the doctor in Boston, had helped Thomas through his illness. Perhaps it would be enough. For hours she worked, cleaning wounds, trying to ease his breathing. She elevated his head, applied cold compresses to reduce swelling. The medicine man watched without protest, occasionally offering his own remedies, herbs and poultices that smelled of sage and earth. As the sun climbed higher, Grey Wolf stirred. His eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found her face. "Sarah?" The word was barely a whisper, his damaged throat making speech agony. "Don't talk," she said, tears flowing freely. "Save your strength." His hand found hers, weak but warm, alive, wonderfully, impossibly alive. Over the next days, Sarah refused to leave his side. She slept in snatches, always waking to check his breathing. Slowly, painfully, he began to improve. The swelling reduced, his breathing eased. The medicine man nodded approval at her efforts, and a tentative respect grew between them despite the language barrier. Ayanna served as translator when needed, but often words weren't necessary. The universal language of healing, of care, transcended cultural boundaries. Sarah learned to prepare the herbal teas that eased pain, while the medicine man accepted her white medicine when it proved effective. On the fourth day, Grey Wolf was able to speak more clearly, though his voice remained rough. "You should not have come. Too dangerous. You would have done the same for me." Sarah replied, checking the bandages on his neck. "Your people will search for you." She'd thought of that constantly. By now, her absence would have been discovered. Agnes would be frantic. The captain would be suspicious, but none of it mattered compared to the man before her. "Let them search." Grey Wolf studied her face, seeing the resolution there. "You cannot stay here forever." "Why not?" The question emerged fierce, desperate. "What is there for me in Cedar Ridge? A life of pretense, watching the cavalry destroy your people while I serve tea in men's shirts? This is not your world." "Neither is that one. Not anymore." She gripped his hand. "You said some people were worth living for. Did you mean it?" His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "Every word. Then don't send me away." That evening, the camp held council. Sarah sat beside Grey Wolf, understanding little of the words but feeling the weight of decision. Some argued for sending her back. She was a danger to them all. Others, led by Ayanna and the medicine man, spoke of the debt they owed her for saving their war chief's life. Finally, Grey Wolf spoke, his damaged voice carrying surprising authority. When he finished, the elderly chief who led this band was quiet for a long moment. Then he addressed Sarah directly in broken English. "You save Grey Wolf, this is good, but white woman with Apache brings death to all. Soldiers come, search, find us, kill us." He paused, studying her. "Unless," Sarah prompted. "Unless you are not white woman, unless you are Apache wife." Sarah's breath caught. Beside her, Grey Wolf went very still. The chief continued. "Apache wife is Apache. No one can take, but must be true wife, true heart, not just words. You understand?" Sarah understood perfectly. This wasn't just about protection or convenience. They were asking if she could truly leave her old life behind, become one of them in every meaningful way. She looked at Grey Wolf, saw the question in his eyes, not pressure, just patient, waiting for her choice. She thought of Cedar Ridge, of the narrow room and narrow minds, of a life circumscribed by others' expectations. Then she thought of the past days, the community she'd witnessed despite hardship, the respect she'd earned through action rather than birthright, the man beside her who'd shown her what love could transcend. "I understand," she said clearly, "and I accept." The council erupted in discussion, but the chief raised his hand for silence. He spoke to Grey Wolf, who translated, his voice rough with emotion. "He says tomorrow, when the sun sets, if I am strong enough, if you are certain." "I'm certain," Sarah said without hesitation. "But are you? Your people have lost so much to mine. Can you truly accept?" Grey Wolf silenced her with a gentle finger to her lips. "You are not your people or mine. You are Sarah, who sees with clear eyes and loves with brave heart. This is enough. More than enough." That night, the women took Sarah away to prepare her. Ayanna and others she'd come to know bathed her in the creek, washed her hair with yucca root, dressed her in soft deerskin decorated with beadwork. They painted her face with the ochre and white clay in patterns she didn't understand but found beautiful. "You give up much," Ayanna said as she worked. "Your people will call you traitor, white whore, other ugly words. They're not my people." Sarah replied, "Not anymore." Ayanna smiled then, the first real warmth she'd shown. "Then perhaps you survive. Apache life is hard, but also free. You will see." As the sun set the next day, painting the canyon walls in shades of fire, Sarah stood beside Grey Wolf before the gathered band. He wore his finest clothing, though he still moved carefully, the marks of his ordeal still visible, but his eyes were clear, full of something that made her heart race. The ceremony was unlike any Christian wedding she'd known. There were prayers to spirits she didn't recognize, rituals involving smoke and sacred items. But at its heart was something universal. Two people pledging their lives to each other, witnessed by community. When it was done, when she was truly Grey Wolf's wife and he her husband, the band celebrated with quiet joy. There was food and storytelling, children shyly bringing her small gifts, warriors nodding respect to their chief who'd chosen love over hatred. Late that night, in their own shelter, Grey Wolf held her gently, mindful of his still healing body. "No regrets?" he asked. Sarah touched the turquoise at her throat, no longer hidden but worn proudly. "None. For the first time in my life, I'm where I belong." "It will not be easy. We must move constantly, hide always. The war continues." "I know." She pressed closer to his warmth. "But we'll face it together." Outside, the desert night sang its ancient songs. Inside, two souls from different worlds created their own, founded on something stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. Love had triumphed where violence had failed, building a bridge across the chasm of hate. Sarah Bennett was no more. In her place was something new, a woman who'd found her true self in the most unlikely circumstances, who'd chosen love over safety, freedom over acceptance. The future was uncertain, fraught with danger, but wrapped in her husband's arms, listening to his heartbeat strong and sure. She had never been more certain of her choice. 6 months had passed since Sarah chose love over the life she'd known. The band had moved constantly, staying ahead of cavalry patrols, finding sanctuary in hidden valleys and secret canyons known only to the Apache. Sarah had adapted to the nomadic life with surprising resilience, her soft hands growing calloused, her pale skin bronzing under the desert sun. Grey Wolf had fully recovered, though his voice carried a permanent rasp from his near hanging. He led his people with quiet strength, always seeking paths that would avoid confrontation while keeping his band safe. But the territory was shrinking, the soldiers growing more aggressive, and everyone knew this couldn't last forever. It was on a crisp autumn morning when Grey Wolf made his decision. The band had gathered for council, and Sarah sat with the women, understanding most of the Apache language now. Though she still struggled with pronunciation. "We cannot keep running," Grey Wolf said, his scarred voice carrying across the circle. "Our children grow up knowing only fear. Our elders die far from sacred places. This is not life, it is slow death." The war chief of the band, an older man named Joseph Crow Feather, nodded grimly. "What do you propose?" "There is a valley, far to the north, beyond the white settlements, beyond the soldiers' reach, where the mountains meet the sky." Grey Wolf's eyes swept the gathered people. "It will be a hard journey. Some may not survive. But there, perhaps, we can live as Apaches should live." Discussion erupted, some arguing for fighting, others for surrender to the reservation system. But Grey Wolf's voice cut through the debate. "I have walked between worlds. I have seen what comes. The white tide cannot be stopped. It will sweep across these lands like floodwater. But water always finds the lowest ground. We must find the high places, the forgotten places, where we can preserve our ways until the world changes again." Sarah felt pride swell in her chest. This was the man she'd chosen, not just a warrior, but a visionary who saw beyond the immediate conflict to a possible future. It took a week to prepare. The band gathered supplies, said prayers over the ancestral grounds they were leaving, and began the long journey north. Sarah rode beside her husband, no longer the frightened white woman who'd gotten lost in the desert, but a capable member of the band who could set up camp, prepare meals from desert plants, and even track game when needed. The journey was arduous. They traveled at night when possible, resting during the day in whatever shelter they could find. The elderly and very young rode, while others walked, covering miles of harsh terrain. Sarah's medical skills proved invaluable when accidents occurred or when the harsh conditions took their toll. 2 weeks into the journey, they encountered another fleeing band, led by a chief named Marcus Standing Bear. His people had been attacked by soldiers. Their village burned. Only half had survived. The two groups merged, sharing resources and protection, united in their search for sanctuary. It was during a rest day in a hidden canyon that Ayanna approached Sarah with knowing eyes. "You are with child," she stated rather than asked. Sarah's hand went to her still flat belly. She had suspected, but hadn't been certain. "How did you know?" "The way you move, the way you refuse certain foods, the way Grey Wolf watches you with new tenderness." Ayanna smiled. "It is good. New life brings hope." That evening, Sarah told Grey Wolf. His reaction was everything she'd hoped, joy tempered with concern, pride mixed with protectiveness. He held her gently. One hand splayed over her stomach as if he could already feel the life growing there. "Our child will be born free," he promised. "Not on reservation, not in hiding, but in a place where they can be both Apache and more." The journey grew more difficult as they climbed higher into the mountains. Snow began to fall, and the cold bit through even the warmest furs. They lost 2 elders to the harsh conditions, conducting burial rites in hidden caves, unable to give them the proper ceremonies for fear of detection. But finally, after 6 weeks of travel, they created a rise and saw it. A vast valley protected by towering peaks, with a crystal-clear lake at its center and forests of pine and aspen. Steam rose from hot springs near the lake's edge, and game trails crisscrossed the meadows. "Home," Grey Wolf breathed, and the word was taken up by others. A whisper of hope that grew to cries of joy. The valley was everything they'd hoped, isolated, defensible, with fresh water, abundant game, and shelter from winter storms. They set up camp near the hot springs, using their warmth to ease the transition. Everyone worked together, building sturdy shelters, gathering food for winter storage, exploring their new territory. Sarah had never been happier. Her pregnancy progressed well under Ayanna's care, and she threw herself into creating a real home. The shelter she shared with Grey Wolf became a warm haven, decorated with her own beadwork, a blend of Apache patterns and designs from her past life that created something entirely new. Winter in the valley was hard but manageable. The hot springs provided warmth and healing. The forests yielded game. and the band's spirits rose with each passing day of freedom. Children played without fear. Elders told stories without watching for soldiers, and life found its rhythm again. Sarah gave birth as spring returned to the valley, with Ayanna attending and Grey Wolf holding her hand. Their son emerged healthy and strong, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's determined chin. They named him Thomas Soaring Eagle, honoring both heritages, both worlds he would inherit. As she held her son for the first time, with Grey Wolf beside her and their adopted family celebrating outside, Sarah thought of the journey that had brought her here. From a grieving widow seeking escape in a frontier town, to a woman who'd found love across enemy lines, who'd chosen an uncertain future over a safe but empty existence. The world beyond their valley continued its conflicts. The Apache wars raged on. Territories were carved up, and two peoples who might have learned from each other instead brought mutual destruction. But here, in this hidden sanctuary, a different story was being written. Sarah looked up at Grey Wolf, saw the love and wonder in his eyes as he touched their son's tiny fist. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing his question from their wedding night. "None," she replied, meaning it completely. "We've found something most people never do, a place where love matters more than blood, where family is chosen rather than assigned, where two worlds can become one." As the sun set over their valley, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose, Sarah nursed her son while Grey Wolf sang softly in Apache, a blessing song for new life, for new beginnings. Through the door of their shelter, she could see others going about their evening routines, Ayanna teaching young girls beadwork, Joseph Crowfeather instructing boys in traditional skills, families gathering for the evening meal. It wasn't the life she'd imagined when she'd stepped off that wagon in Cedar Ridge so long ago. It was harder in many ways, simpler in others, but it was real, honest, and founded on something stronger than prejudice or fear. The turquoise at her throat caught the last light of day, warm against her skin. A warrior's gift had become a bridge between worlds, a symbol of the love that had conquered every obstacle placed before it. Sarah closed her eyes, listening to her husband's voice, feeling her child's warm weight, surrounded by the family she'd chosen and who had chosen her. In the end, that's what mattered. Not the color of skin or the accent of words, but the connections between hearts brave enough to reach across the divide. The Apache's voice had indeed cut through the night, asking her to be his woman, and she had found the courage to meet his eyes and say yes. Everything else had followed from that moment of truth, that leap of faith. Their story would not be recorded in the history books that spoke of conquest and resistance, of winners and losers in the clash of civilizations. But here in this valley, in the hearts of those who lived it, the story would endure. Proof that love could bloom even in the harshest ground, that two people from different worlds could create a third world all their own, and that sometimes the greatest victory was simply choosing to see the humanity in each other's eyes. Thank you all for listening to this Wild West love story. I'm curious to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps somewhere unexpected? Please subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear what touched you most about Sarah and Grey Wolf's journey, and where in the world their story has reached you today.